All right, good morning, everybody. There's a few empty seats up here if you want them. This is really low, I should have thought about that. Oh yeah, it's free. Ooh. Quality though, right? There's always something. There's always something. Everyone's good? Everyone has a seat? Okay, I'm going to do this. All right, good morning, everybody. I just wanted to take a second and make sure I welcome all of you. It's really important that we kind of make sure that you know how welcome you are here, and this is definitely everyone is creative, everyone is welcome type feel. So thank you for coming. Thank you for waking up early. Thank you for fighting the La Machine traffic and being here and enjoying the great breakfast that we have out for you today. So just quickly, CreativeMornings is in 172 cities across the world. So who has been to CreativeMornings before? I should start with that. Awesome. So anyone new? Raise your hand. Oh, that's like 50-50. That's great. That's awesome. Okay, so we're in 172 cities now across the world. So that's 62 countries, and that's about 20,000 people every month that gather for these Creative Mornings. So pretty cool to think about when you think of the big numbers. So our event is always free. All Creative Mornings are always free, and that's made possible by global sponsors. So Shutterstock, Adobe, Wix, and oh, you're going too fast, Lisa. Hop back. No, that's good. And MailChimp. And we have a really exciting news. Well, it's exciting for us, a little less for you, but we've just brought on a new global sponsor this month. It's Adobe. So round of applause for Adobe. As some of you may know, Creative Mornings is fully sponsored by its obviously global sponsors, but also the community sponsors that we have as well. So it's thanks to people like you that we're able to do this every month, and we do it for you. So it's a really beautiful full circle there. And if you're traveling this summer, so the next one, know that Creative Mornings is open to everyone. So if you're in Berlin, if you're in Tokyo, if you're just down the street in Toronto, know that you can attend any of these Creative Mornings. You just have to do the same thing as you do here. You register online and you show up. And it's a really nice way to get to know the city from a more personal point of view. And again, as you can tell this morning, the room is very friendly. Everyone's very welcoming, and you get that nice feel everywhere you go. So I definitely encourage you. And if you're interested in doing this, I'm very happy to connect you with the host there too. So if you want to have a little bit more of a hands-on experience, let me know. I'll be glad to connect you. So if you've attended Creative Mornings before, you're probably familiar with the manifesto. And this just kind of breathes the truths and values that is Creative Mornings. And instead of bringing someone up here to make them read it, it's not very popular, or having myself read it, I just want to pull out one little sentence here that I think is really relevant, especially with this talk. It's the idea that a creative life requires bravery and action, honesty and hard work. I'll just let that do a second while I grab a drink. Yeah, and I think that's a really relevant phrase for today's talk. But also when we talk about what Creative Mornings is and why we gather. We gather to have these conversations. We want to make sure that you can take what you learned today, or what you happen to spark with somebody you meet in the room, and able to have those conversations in a healthy, respectful way outside this room as well. So definitely important for us to make sure that that's really what you're experiencing when you're here, and part of why we gather. Another reason why we gather, of course, is to celebrate our monthly theme. So this month we're talking about equality, and I'm honored to, I'm not there yet. Next one. Thank God for the slides. Yeah, so please make sure you share your morning while you're here. A fun little tidbit is, like I said, these happen in cities across the world. So if you use the hashtag CMEquality, you can actually see the conversations that people are having in their own cities this morning, as well as other Fridays along this month. So please feel free to use that. Feel free to jump in those conversations and really kind of explore all the beauty that Creative Mornings is. Yeah, and so without further ado, I'd like to invite Dillon Black to the stage, Ottawa's very own. Hi everybody, how's it going? Good.
That picture's always funny. Everybody's like, oh man, you look like you're 16. And I'm like, yeah, I know. I look 16. I look like Justin Bieber. It's fine. No, it was like 2 years ago. Awesome. Okay, so thank you so much for being here. I am not a morning person, so this is a really interesting kind of adventure for me. So thank you for being willing to kind of join that. Today I'm going to be talking to you folks about equality, or at least sort of about equality. Hopefully we kind of end up there. Mostly I want to talk to you about what it means to kind of build bridges across difference. So before I do any kind of work, usually what I like to start off with is by taking a moment for us to honor the land that we're on. So currently we are on the unceded Algonquin territory. This land was never given up, it was never surrendered, it was taken without consent. And I think for me, in the work that I do, that's really important. It's really important to honor the history, to honor the legacies of colonialism and kind of the violence that existed here in order to move forward and look at issues like equality and look at how do we come together as communities to kind of make change. So that's kind of the place that I like to start from. And also, I really love this quote. It's by Dr. Gabor Mate in the realm of Hungry Goats. He's a doctor who works down in the downtown east side of Vancouver, working with folks who are living on the streets, people dealing with addictions, people who are experiencing a lot of trauma. And some people are attracted to painful places because they hope to resolve their own pain there. Others offer themselves because their compassionate hearts know that here is where love is most needed. So my name is Dillon, and I am less than a kilometer away from you, if you ever go on dating applications. Just teasing. So I'm a queer social worker, and I have been working for the last, I think, 6 or 7 years in sexual violence, in anti-violence, and doing community work. So that's kind of the place that I'm starting from. I also want to kind of acknowledge that this isn't going to be an easy thing to talk about. So if you're willing to kind of go on that journey with me, this isn't going to, I hope you leave inspired, but I just want to let you know that this is going to be some hard things that we're going to be talking about, so just to kind of brace yourself and to kind of be able to be vulnerable with me in that way. I've been in Ottawa my whole life, and I don't have a whole lot to say. I'm a social worker. I'm going to be starting my PhD in the fall, looking at criminology and surveillance studies. And mostly all you need to know about me is that I'm really committed to community. I'm messy, I'm imperfect, and hopefully that's enough to be able to talk about this. Who here identifies as a feminist, or is kind of, maybe exploring feminism? Okay, cool. Oh, okay. Oh, more hands. Okay, cool. Awesome. So I know it's like the other F word that nobody wants to talk about, right? So I'm a huge feminist, and I come from kind of that place. And feminism for me is really about kind of creating a world in which everybody from every gender and every sexuality has everything they need to be able to kind of move through the world in a way that's safe and self-determining for themselves. So that's kind of my place that I start from. And I also work in the feminist movement, so I have to be like, hey, shout out to feminism. They kind of brought me here. And I'm not an expert. Just want to let you know, not an expert. I don't know everything. You're all coming here with your own knowledges and your own experiences, and that's just as important. So I hope that you bring that in the question and answer period. So also another thing that I like to start from too is that I really like this saying. Has anybody heard "Nothing about us without us"? So it's a really awesome slogan that came from the 1980s and the HIV/AIDS movement, and I really like to pay homage to and honor that kind of history too, especially being a person from the LGBTQ community, because when you're creating policy, when you're thinking about equality, when you're doing the work that you're doing, you also have to think about who that work most impacts, right? And you have to think about how do we center those people who are affected the most in those conversations. We can't create spaces, we can't create policies, we can't create programming or anything really without thinking about who's being impacted and also who are we talking about. And another place that I also come from is looking at things through a trauma-informed lens. So if you haven't heard about trauma-informed practice, I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about that. And I think looking at trauma and looking at how people are affected by trauma is really important when we're talking about issues around equality, because a lot of the pain that people experience, a lot of the violence that they experience, a lot of the inequalities and the inequities really comes from that trauma-based place. And if we can't tend to the pain and the trauma that people are living in their lives, then we can't build a world that is equal or is based on equity, or where people get everything that they need to live healthy and safe and authentic lives. And also, a thing that I really like to talk about is the fact that in our society, we really individualize a lot of things, and I think that's a really problematic way of looking at things. When we talk about depression, when we talk about mental health, when we talk about violence, when we talk about, poverty, homelessness, all of those really big key issues that kind of are in our social and cultural narrative, that we don't look at it from looking at like, okay, so how is the system structured in a way that kind of creates barriers to people getting the things that they need, right? So if I'm only looking at people as individual folks, like he was depressed, he, completed suicide, we're not looking at the ways in which the world is structured so that it creates a condition in which people can't get the things that they need. And if we don't look at the world in that way, and in terms of how it's kind of designed, then we're not actually getting at the root of the problem, right? It's just very individual. It's not looking at the whole picture. So that's something that I kind of want to consider in inequality. So I kind of start from a grassroots sort of place. There's a lot of history of movements in Canada, the civil rights movement in the United States, the 1970s, 1980s. I think it's really important for us to kind of acknowledge that there's like a lot of work that has come before us, and there's a lot of work to kind of be done moving forward. So I really think that grassroots kind of social justice activism is a really great place. And I think when you bridge that with creativity and the work that people do, I don't know what you folks do in your day-to-day lives, but that's kind of a really important place for me to start. And I think we all need to acknowledge kind of all the work that everybody's done to get to the place that we are today in the world. So I work at Optiva. Have you ever heard of Optiva? Okay, cool. So that's the Ottawa Coalition in Violence Against Women. We're a tiny yet mighty organization in Ottawa dealing with the issue of how do we respond in a community-based and city-wide way to the issues of violence. And one of the really cool things that I'm currently working on is, has anybody heard about the Globe and Mail unfounded cases? So it's a really big thing that happened in January. And basically what we kind of found out is that in most police services across Canada, that there's a really high rate of unfounding of sexual assault cases. So the work that I'm doing currently is province and Canada-wide, and it's actually going in and working with police services and actually opening up sexual assault investigations and cases. And it's looking at how do police practices and how does inequity and gender bias and racialized bias kind of play into policing practices, and how can we work together to kind of change that? Because if over 40% of cases of sexual assault when people go to report are being unfounded, then that's a really huge problem, right? So that's kind of the work that I'm currently doing, and that's kind of the place that I'm starting from. And last year I was appointed, you probably read this, to the Status Women, Minister of Status Women's Federal Committee to help shape the federal strategy on gender-based violence, and that was just launched last month, so that was really exciting for us. So it's actually really cool to be part of a country and a government who actually takes gender-based violence in a really serious way, and who are willing to kind of listen to women's issues, to LGBTQ people's issues, to really look at how, as a country and as a community, we can kind of come together and fix these issues that are really problematic. Because the rates of violence haven't changed since the last, I think, 3 decades or 4 decades. I also start from a place, I identify as gender non-conforming. So that means that I don't identify as a man or a woman. I kind of identify somewhere in between, or somewhere kind of even just out of that as well. So if you see me, I really like to use the pronouns they and them. Slide. One more. Yeah. I like David Bowie. I was really sad. I was like, oh my God, David Bowie's dead. The world can fall apart. And it kind of did, really. Keep going. Right? That was a bad year. I was like, David Bowie, Prince, Trump, it was just like not good. Another thing you need to know is my life is a torturous push and pull between my undying, my love for feminism, but also my undying love for The Bachelor. So, when I'm talking about all these issues, like I also, watch really bad TV. So I just wanted you to know that. But don't worry, there's hope for me and there's hope for you. So hopefully we can kind of move forward with that. So I have a really awkward kind of confession right now. So it's going to cause me a lot of anxiety to really tell you about this. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, anxiety, right. So I'm feeling that right now. I just want to let you know that, you can go to the next slide if you want. I actually don't really like the term equality. Oh, right, that's awkward, talking about equality. And I'll just tell you a bit of the reason why, you can go to the next slide, is that because when we look at the concept of equality versus equity, I don't know if you really know the difference, but equality kind of assumes that, oh, you can go back, sorry. equality kind of assumes that everybody's starting from the same place. If you see these three young men, they're kind of looking over the fence. I don't really know why they're playing baseball, because I'm like, this isn't really about baseball, it's about people's lives, but we'll just go with the metaphor of the baseball field. So they're looking over the fence, there's a little guy and the medium-sized guy and the taller guy, and they're all in the same box. When we look at equity, it's kind of starting from a place of, everybody has different needs and differences. And so what does it take to build a world where everybody gets what they need to be able to see over the fence? And then, if you move to the next slide, I love this concept even better, liberation, because, oh my God, the fence is gone, right? So we're getting rid of even the fence, the thing that causes barriers to looking at the baseball game in the first place. I love baseball, but I don't really get the metaphor. So part of what I'm saying is, if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time, but if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. So I really like to talk about equality and equity and liberation and kind of breaking down those barriers to make sure that everybody gets what they need and that we can build a world that is equal and equitable and that everybody feels safe and belongs. Awesome. So it's not a coincidence that I came to this work. I'm going to depress you guys for a little couple of minutes, and then we're going to hopefully get over that hump together. And so for me, my journey started in, you can go to the next slide, as a method of healing and resistance. And I'll go to the next slide. Sorry, I don't have clickers for this. And so it was really hard for me growing up. I came out at the age of 13 or 14 in the 90s, and it was not like it was years and years ago, but at the time it was really lonely. I came from a bit of a small town. I thought I was the only gay person there. When I was 17, I met the other gay person, and I'm like, oh my God, there's the other gay person. We have to be together. It didn't matter. It didn't matter, who this person was. I was like, you're the only other gay person, so we need to be together. And we were. It lasted a good year, and that was my kind of journey into that. But really, the way that I came to this work was in 2007, and you can go to the next slide. I was 20 then, and I'm almost 30. Actually, I am 30 now. Wow, okay. I'm 30 now. And it all started for me at Carleton University. So I was 20. It was my first year of university. I was walking late night, back from class late one night to my car in the parking lot. And there I was actually sexually assaulted by 3 men. And so not only was that a really kind of impactful experience for me, I was targeted for the way that I look, for my gender, misogyny, all those things kind of played up in that. And, we talk about stranger danger, all that kind of stuff. But, that was my experience, and that's what happened for me. And it's really interesting because the year in 2007, at the same time, there's a really high-profile sexual assault case at Carleton where another young woman was sexually assaulted, and Carleton, in their legal defense statement, said, she didn't take the precautionary measures to protect herself or to keep herself safe. And that was a really big thing back in 2007. And, it doesn't necessarily get easier as time goes on, but I think you get stronger. And I think when you talk to survivors of violence, they will always tell you that. And I cannot convey to you the enormity of that night for me, and kind of the way that impacted me the rest of my life. And for a long time, it feels like you're running, and you're not really sure where you're going or how to get there. And I think as survivors, a lot of us spend a lot of our time running from things. Next slide. And you run from it for as long as you can until you finally have to face it. And you have to carry it with you wherever you go. Through every crack, through every crevice, along every edge and cliff. And you always contemplate the jump, but you don't want to fall off. I couldn't get out of bed for weeks. And some days I had to shower 6 times a day because I couldn't get that feeling away from me. And I actually had to quit school. I lost a really significant scholarship. The one thing that my parents didn't really understand what's going on with me. I didn't know how to tell them. It was a very isolating feeling, very lonely. I went to the school counselor and they didn't believe me because, the way that I look, all these other things, and they kind of just turned me away. And this is something that's happening to a lot of people at the time. But one of the things I didn't expect was the amount of friends that I didn't think I would lose at the time. And, because there's a lot of shame in that, when you disclose, people don't know what to do, right? So for me, it's kind of trying to pick up the pieces and build life all over again every day. And that was really hard. Why would somebody want to sexually assault someone who looks like you? It's kind of the message that I got over and over again. And For me, every day feels like that day sometimes, whether I like smell perfume that reminds me of that night, whether I see cars that remind me of that night. So in a way, that trauma's kind of always there, no matter like how you build yourself back up. And a lot of the times I don't think that, I'm necessarily a survivor, but it's like surviving, because it's a constant thing, right? And it's constant rebuilding of yourself. But don't worry, I'm okay. There's a lot of ways in which I think people who experience really traumatic things kind of are really, really powerful, and they're really resilient. So I don't want us to focus too much on the tragedy narrative. I really want us to kind of focus on, even though people experience really traumatic things in their lives, that they can actually come back from it, and it's really powerful. And that's kind of the message that I want to kind of leave you folks in terms of telling my story. But I can't not tell you my story, because it's a huge part of why I am here today. And one really cool thing that happened to me was I actually met a lot of other young women at the time who were doing a really cool thing where they wanted to fight for sexual self-support center because they knew that the school wasn't doing anything about it, and it wasn't a standalone thing. This is kind of happening across campuses, across country, across high schools, across our streets, in our communities, that people weren't talking about it. So it was 11 young women who had all been impacted in the same way. And for the first time, I met other people whose stories sounded kind of like mine. And what they did was really cool, is that, like most feminists do, we held a bake sale, and we made some at the Great Glebe Garage Sale, because the Glebe, and they have a lot of money, and they like gluten-free treats, and we can sell them for like $2. It was awesome. So we made a lot of money, and we, because it was like the late 2000s, we bought a bunch of like crappy flip phones. Actually, Anna Lori's here, and she was part of that really awesome young group of women. And what we decided to do is we decided to start our own crisis line. So it was the first peer-led, student-led crisis line for students. And we decided to do that on our own, because hey, the school's not going to do it, we're going to do it. And 5 years later, after advocating against the school, even though they threatened us with lawsuits and all these other sorts of things, they actually decided to open the sexual self-support center. And that wouldn't have happened without the work and the commitment and the power and the strength of community and of young women who decided to take it into their own hands. So I think that's kind of the place where I start from. And I think if you think you can't challenge a giant institution, you think you can't do things that you really want to do, you totally can. And here I am today, continuing to do that type of work, but also just really honoring the fact that I come from that group of young women who gave me so much. And I think that kind of brings us back to the thing is that in a lot of ways we're all at risk of something, right? So when we talk about people, we talk about that they're at risk, living in poverty, marginalization, all these sorts of things, and that if you're walking by someone on the street who's experiencing homelessness, if you're talking to someone who's experienced violence, survivors, whatever, that at some point in their lives, that wasn't necessarily the condition of their life, right? So we all have the capacity to kind of end up that way, and I think compassion and empathy and looking at things and looking at the structures in which, and the barriers and the steps that kind of got those people there, if we look at it through that way in a more compassionate lens, then we're able to really kind of understand, and it also gives a lot of hope. So I think when we talk about these issues, there's not enough hope, so I want to leave you a little bit more hopeful. So, okay, take a little bit of a moment to breathe, and thank you for being willing to kind of come on that journey with me. And I'm just going to tell you a couple little bit things about what I think about equality, or kind of how you can take action in your life to kind of do something about it. Yeah. So, sexual violence and oppression and all the things that we're talking about doesn't just happen at night. It doesn't just happen because a stranger decided that they wanted to attack women. It happens because we live in a world that is inequitable. It happens because we live in a world where violence, oppression, sexism, racism, all those things exist. And if we don't acknowledge that those things exist, then we can't really tackle that problem. It happens because we live in a culture in which people aren't held accountable for the harm that they cause. It's teachers, don't get raped instead of don't rape, and that's kind of the thing. And if you're looking at it through a sexual violence lens, it's also a systemic problem, right? Because I don't know if anybody know, but the criminal justice system is just really ineffective for that issue particularly. So out of every 1,000 sexual assaults in Canada, only 33 are ever reported to the police, only 29 are ever recorded as a crime, only 12 have charges laid, 6 are prosecuted, and 3 lead to conviction. So out of 1,000 sexual assaults that happen every year, and there's 460,000 of them that happen, probably more now, only 3 lead to conviction, and 997 assailants walk free. That's 1% of conviction rate in Canada. There are over 1,200 missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada as well. And if you look at that in terms of the population of Indigenous folks, it's a really, really high rate. If you look at the homelessness issue here in Ottawa, particularly with young people, over half of homeless youth experiencing homelessness in Ottawa are identified as LGBTQ. So they're being rejected by their families, they're being put in situations where they have to leave home, they're not safe, and that's a huge problem that we're not really looking at either. In Canada, the bullying and the suicidality of young LGBT people is really high. There's a lot of high poverty, there's a lot of looking at housing crises, people unable to get employment. Just recently, actually, Bill C-16 was passed, which is really cool. So for the first time ever, it's legislated that gender identity is actually explicitly protected in our human rights framework, which is like a huge deal. And it's a really huge deal considering that our neighbors to the south are actually taking away rights. So that's another thing too when you're talking about equality and you're talking about rights and human rights, is that it's not a for sure thing, right? It's something that we have to keep working at and fighting for, because at any moment it could get legislated or things could kind of go backwards. That progress isn't always linear, it's something that we have to keep actively working towards. Again, trans youth and trans people in Ontario experience a lot of things. The PTSD rate in trans people and LGBT youth is higher than the PTSD rate in military veterans who have gone and done service across youth. So that's another big thing to kind of look at when we're looking at equality, just looking at, what kind of inequities are we facing as a community. Ermagerd, yeah, right. I know, I'm kind of bombarding you with a lot of this is really sad and bad, but the only reason I'm telling you this is because, first of all, I think we need to know, I think we need to acknowledge that these things are going on, and also it's the only way that we can do something about it, right? So, for me, it's really looking about how all oppression and all violence and everything that we're talking about is all connected, right? Because we don't live single issue lives. So, I like to look at it from the social determinants of health lens. So it's really looking at, people's family structures, their housing, the criminal justice system, language, racism, culture, access to food, access to health, gender, the land and resource that we're on. If we can't look at this through a holistic lens, then we can't actually tackle the issue of equality and equity. And, I think in this work, a lot of us have our moment of heartbreak. So for me, I remember I was working in a young women's drop-in years ago, and one of the things that I found, it kind of was this moment, because I went into social work because I really wanted to do something about it. But I also realized now today that even social work has its own problems and its own complicity in the issue, right? So for me, I remember I was working this drop-in, there was this young woman, and she was homeless, and she was Indigenous, and she had just experienced human trafficking. And she went through a really, really difficult time, and the only place that she felt safe was at this drop-in. But because of organizational policies, every day after the drop-in was done, people had to leave. And because we were social workers and because of ethics, we weren't allowed to help them get home. We weren't allowed to accompany them. And there was all these kind of barriers in which it made it hard to connect with the client. And one day she wasn't able to leave, and we didn't know what else to do. So the organization ended up calling the police on her to have her removed. So it was kind of this really heartbreaking moment for me where I was like, oh my God, I am doing this work that is calling the police, right? It was just kind of this really weird moment where I was like, this is so messed up, and I was like, we need to fix that, right? So it's also looking inwards and looking at, what is our role in changing things, and but also what are, how are we acting in ways that can be harmful, or acting in ways that kind of help support those kind of not great or violent kind of structures that we live in. So it's also kind of being a bit self-reflective in the work that we're doing. Yeah, so I was saying there's no single issue struggle because we don't really live single issue lives, and that's a quote from Audre Lorde. And for us, I think, leading this, it's all about a paradigm shift. It's looking at the issue of intersectionality. It's kind of a really often not new concept, it's actually really old, that was developed by Kimberly Crenshaw. But we're talking a lot about intersectionality now, and it's really looking at how all the different pieces of our lives, all of our identities, all of our experiences, how those kind of play out and come together and look at issues around power. And for me, it's also looking at the neurobiological consequences of trauma. So it's also looking at how trauma impacts our lives, how trauma, if you experience trauma as a young person, your brain actually changes and develops differently. If you look at a neurobiological scanner, the neurons in the brain are actually different. It changes you. When you're trying to understand trauma, you have to understand it's not a disorder, but a reaction to a kind of wound. It's a reaction to profoundly injurious events and situations in the real world, and indeed to a world in which people are repeatedly wounded. So I think when we're talking about trauma, and we're looking at people, we also need to understand that this is the world that we live in. The world is hurting people, and how do we come together to stop that? It's about building communities and understanding that we need to do everything that we can in our power that requires for us to change our understanding of what it means to look at issues of equality, right? So changing our knowledges, reading, doing all these kinds of things. I'll talk a little bit more about that. It's about changing our culture and our society, not just blaming people for the violence they experience, blaming them or individualizing things. It's really understanding how the world comes together to create these things. It's about listening. I work a lot with young people, and I think the best thing that I've ever learned is really just talking with young people. They know so much more than I do. So, if somebody who's young in your life comes to you and they say, hey, I really need your help, it's not about shaming or blaming them. It's really about being like, okay, like, what can I do to support you? And ultimately understanding that they're the expert of that issue. It's looking at the concept of freedom. I think when we talk about freedom and liberation, equality, I always want to ask the question, but for who, right? So when we're talking about policymaking programs, we're talking about community, it's really looking at, like, okay, but who's this for? It's also about moving past safety. I think we focus a lot on safety, and I think safety is really important. But I think if we move past safety, we get to a place of self-determination, which means that, again, everybody gets what they need. And also, it's not just about being safe, because I don't just want to be safe. I want to live a full and healthy and actualized life. Because power is taken and never given, and that's a quote from Gloria Steinem. And we all need to kind of step up and be able to do that change and to be able to find what it is within ourselves to move forward in the world and say something. So, they talk a lot about bystander intervention and all that kind of stuff, but if we can't come together as communities, if we can't speak out on things, if we can't show up to places, whether it's a vigil or it's, coming to the city and doing, and supporting, something that your community is doing, volunteering, donating time or money or resources, then we can't do that. And I also say this too, because I think, at least in the social justice activist kind of world, there's a lot of expectation to be perfect and to always get it right. And I would say that that's not necessarily true, because we're not supposed to be perfect, but we're supposed to be useful. And you should start where you are and use what you have and do what you can. So even if you don't know everything, we don't all know everything, there are things that you folks can do to make that change and to help build a world that is more equal. And also that it's a process, especially when you're talking about allyship or being allies. It is not an identity, it is a process. And it's also about consent, it's about asking people what they need. It isn't just about basic decency, it's about learning. So it's about, learning as much as you can, talking to people, going and speaking on things, putting yourself out there, being vulnerable. It's about growing. It's about attending to trauma. The ways you experience trauma are not always obvious or recognized. It's appropriate practices, interventions, support. The way that trauma kind of operates in our lives is very different. And it's also just understanding that, some people are coming from that place, and what can we do to support them. And it's also moving from a sense of hopelessness to focusing on how people in their lives are empowered and resist violence. It's about reshaping the narrative to grow stories of hope and resilience. So one thing that I always think is, people are so amazing and they do so many cool and creative things to be able to just resist violence in their lives. And I don't think we're asking the right questions. We're not looking at it through the right lens. So for example, when I'm doing work with the police, I'm always kind of working with them being like, okay, but when you're doing this investigation, you're not asking the right questions. So, for example, the way that trauma works, you might hear this a lot of times, they're liars, they're inconsistent, they're not getting their story straight. Sometimes we'll ask, tell your story from start to end, and then say it backwards. And that's the way that they try to figure out whether or not someone is lying or telling the truth when they're reporting incidences. And when someone's experiencing trauma, it's really hard to remember everything, right? Because there's so many ways that your trauma impacts your memory, impacts the way you can recollect things. So I think when we're looking at trauma, it's really about asking the right questions, because it's not like, tell me from start to finish what happened to you, but that person, if I ask her how many holes there are in the ceiling, she'll be able to tell you, right? So I think it's just being able to ask the right questions and to grow those stories. And I just want to leave you with this. Not everything is a disaster, although it probably feels like that from what I'm talking about. And even when it is a disaster, we'll know what to do with it. Because I think that's the way that we kind of end up moving through in the world. And it's about change, and it's about power, like real power, not just empowerment, but I'm talking about real power, real coming together of people to be able to do that kind of equitable work that we need to do. And before I end, I'll just leave you with one thing, and I think it's probably the most important thing. So if somebody in your life trusts you enough to come up to you and tell you the hardest thing that's ever happened to them, the best thing that you can do is believe them. And by believing them, it's not only validating, it's not only taking away the isolation, exclusion, and the shame, it's actually really powerful. And it's the first thing that you can do to help someone in your life that's gone through something and to build equity and build equality. And that, I feel like, is how we're going to possibly rename the world. Thank you.